Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Divine Council mini series. We're already on lesson 8 today, and we have covered a lot of territory already. We started off introducing the idea of divine plurality, which of course means that Yahweh not only created a human family, but also created a divine one and many different divine creatures for that matter. We looked at how evil entered the world. And so far, we've covered all three major rebellions that shaped the course of history. Last time, we ended off on the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, and we actually split that into two parts. Initially, we narrowed it down to just looking at what were they actually trying to accomplish here. And we saw what they were actually trying to do was rebel against Yahweh's mandate of creation from Genesis 1:26 to 28 and the post-flood mandate in Genesis 9, which was to be fruitful, multiply, subdue the earth, and spread out. They didn't want to spread out. They wanted to kind of clump together and build this ziggurat tower where they would call Yahweh down, and they thought they were going to be the ones to call the shots. They were sorely mistaken. So after that, we looked at Yahweh's ultimate judgment. How did he punish them for this? Well, we ended off with Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9, which of course we now know is the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, where Yahweh scattered the nations, he fixed the borders, and he put these nations under the allotment of lesser created Elohim who were meant to rule over them justly. Of course, as we saw and we will see, they ended up getting a bit prideful and they no longer ruled over these nations justly. They wanted all the authority, all the sovereignty, all the power, all the worship for themselves. So, following Genesis 11, we move into Genesis 12, where Yahweh decides to start all over again in the heart of the rebellion with Abraham. This is the third attempt to start over. He's starting his own race, Jacob, my people. He has an allotment all for himself. So today we're going to look at the concept of holy real estate or cosmic geography. So if you're ready and I'm ready, let's get into this, guys. All right, here we go. Holy real estate, or as I said, another term for cosmic geography. So, as I mentioned, last time we looked at the absolute blatant disobedience of the people with regards to Yahweh's creation mandate, which was, of course, outlined in Genesis 11, verses 5 through 9. Now, as I stated, in Genesis 1:28 and Genesis 9:21, we know that Yahweh wanted the people to be fruitful, multiply, subdue the earth, spread out. That didn't happen. We also saw that Yahweh's temporary solution to this problem was to scatter the people, fix the borders, as outlined in Genesis 11 5 through 9. And this, of course, as I mentioned, is correlated with the passage in Deuteronomy 32 8 and 9. Now, in Deuteronomy 32, it refers to Yahweh as the Most High, or Elyon, as he was superior to all other gods of the nations. And you'll notice that when Yahweh is being referred to amongst the pagan nations or amongst the other gods, he is always referred to as the Most High. He is the creator of all other gods. So in Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, we also see that Yahweh kept Israel or kept Jacob. Jacob was Jacob before Israel and his inheritance. He created a dividing line between Israel and the pagan nations. This is that line of cosmic geography. This is the holy real estate we're going to get into. Now, Psalm 82 tells us that the lesser Elohim, or the created Elohim, actually became corrupt. But we don't know how exactly, just that they were unfit for Israelite worship. We see that in Deuteronomy chapter 4, 19 and 20, 17:3, 29:25, and 32:17. It tells us that they will face judgment and die as any rebellious man would. Why don't we actually slow that down and take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 19 and 20, where it says, "And beware lest you raise your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun and the moon and the stars, all the host of heaven, you be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them, things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. But the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be a people of his own inheritance, as you are this day." So Yahweh is warning his people, look, do not raise your eyes to the heavens, do not worship the celestial objects as the pagans do, do not worship anyone else. You are my allotment. I am the one who delivered you. I am the one who offered you grace and delivered you out of that terrible iron furnace that was Egypt. They may not have always been grateful for that, but he did do that. All right. So the nations outside the bounds of Israel were occupied by, we know that they were occupied by descendants of the Nephilim, obviously, the offspring from the forbidden union of Genesis 6:4. And we're going to see that being discussed under Joshua. So Yahweh was warning his people, look, you're going to need to come in and conquer these lands, but they are inhabited by descendants of the Nephilim. They are inhabited by these hybrid creatures, but I am your God and I am with you. I have delivered you and I will continue to deliver you. They didn't always trust him, but he would deliver them nonetheless. So moving forward, out of bounds. So, what does that mean exactly? So, we've just introduced this concept of cosmic geography where there was actually a dividing line geographically. Now, of course, Yahweh owns all the territory. He has created the entire universe. Everything ultimately belongs to him. But as I've already mentioned, for a time, he allotted different nations to different gods. So these nations all had their own territory or these guardian entities that were actually affixed to the land. And although Yahweh owned everything, he is sovereign, of course, all authority is under him. He kept certain holy land or certain territory for himself, and his people, the Israelites, knew this. So, in ancient Israel, it was understood that there was a physical barrier between land that was considered both holy and unholy. So, Yahweh had to teach his people Israel what was considered holy ground. Let's take a look at an example. In 1 Samuel, we see David fleeing from King Saul after he slays Goliath. He flees into territory outside the bounds of Israel and finds himself in a vulnerable position. Let's just take a look at that passage here. 1 Samuel 26, verses 17 to 19. And I'm reading in the ESV, as always. Saul recognized David's voice and said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And David said, "It is my voice, O Lord, my Lord, O King." And he said, "Why does my Lord pursue after his servant? For what have I done? What evil is on my hands? Now therefore, let the Lord, the King, hear the words of his servant. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is men, may they be cursed before the Lord. For they have driven me out this day that I should have no share in the heritage of the Lord, saying, Go serve other gods." Okay, so David's concern is that he's being driven away from the quote inheritance of Yahweh, the inheritance being this geographical area that was the Holy Land. This is Deuteronomy 32 language. So, inheritance in this case is synonymous with an allotted portion of land. So, just to be clear, every guardian entity was not only put in charge of the people nation, they were affixed to certain land borders. And although Yahweh could go on to these lands at any time because he is in charge of everything, he created them after all, he kept certain land for himself, and this was the Holy Land. This is where the Israelites were to stay so that they would not be tempted to go off and worship other gods. Didn't always work so well, but that was the intention. Okay, so in Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, quote, Yahweh's inheritance represented both the people and land he took for himself. This is, of course, echoed by Moses in Deuteronomy 4, verses 19 to 20, which we read at the beginning there, warning the Israelites not to go and worship celestial beings, not to worship these other guardian entities. So going back to David here, David is not ignorant to the fact that Yahweh, or Elyon, is the creator of all space on earth. What he's concerned about is that being driven from his proper place in Israel meant that he could not properly worship Yahweh. And just note that David never complains about being driven from the Ark of the Covenant, as we'll see in 1 Samuel 7:2, nor does he complain about being separated from the tabernacle in 1 Samuel 21 and 22. This specifically relates to being driven from the inheritance of Yahweh, aka the Holy Land. So David is fully aware of this concept of cosmic geography and that the land outside of Yahweh's portion had been allotted to other gods. Okay, moving forward, skincare in the Holy Land. We're going to get into a story that you guys might be familiar with that we've talked about a few times before on this channel. So, just as an Israelite feared that they would be unable to properly worship Yahweh outside the bounds of the Holy Land, we see an example of a pagan actually reaping the benefits of coming across the border into the Holy Land. And this is recorded in 2 Kings chapter 5. This is, of course, the story of Naaman the leper. So, Naaman was a commander of the Syrian army, and he was prompted by a young Israelite servant girl who had been taken captive during one of the Syrian raids to travel to Israel and seek help for his skin condition from the prophet Elisha. So, essentially, when Naaman goes to visit Elisha, Elisha doesn't see him directly, which he's a little bit offended by, but nonetheless, he's told to go and wash himself in the Jordan River 7 times. He first resists this, but then eventually complies, and voila, his skin is healed. So let's just take a look at verses 15 through 19, which will reveal the cosmic geography aspect to this. So, First Kings chapter 5, verses 15 to 19. All right, here we go. So, one second here, guys. Sorry. It's not First Kings, it's Second Kings. My bad. And I have it written right there. I should know that. All right, here we go. Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and he came and stood before him. And he said, Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So accept now a present from your servant. But he said, As the Lord lives before whom I stand, I will receive none. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. Then Naaman said, If not, please let there be given to your servant 2 mule loads of earth. From far now on, your servant will not offer burnt offerings or sacrifices to any god but the Lord. In this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, when I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. He said to him, Go in peace. Okay, so here is where we see that incomparability piece with Yahweh again. There is no one like him. He is the one true God. So Naaman has some solid theology here. He wants to worship Yahweh and make sacrifices to him only, but how can he manage this once he leaves the Holy Land? So, understanding cosmic geography, understanding that this physical territory was Yahweh's allotted Holy Land, the solution for Naaman is to take physical ground or actual soil back with him to Syria so that he can be in physical possession of a piece of Yahweh's inheritance in order to properly worship him. So we aren't told how Naaman uses the dirt specifically, but we do know that this is a powerful theological statement. Dirt was the means by which he showed his believing loyalty to Yahweh. And on a side note, what a testament to the gospel, because things haven't changed, have they? The only theology we have is no different than the theology that Naaman had, which was, I'm clean now. We're clean now. That's all it is, right? Salvation is just a gift, and that is the only theology we have, is that I am clean now. So what a beautiful thing that hasn't changed. And I've used Naaman the leper as an example in my podcast episodes in the past because it's just a beautiful story, because really we're all kind of Naaman the leper, are we not? So it's just a really beautiful story, I think. So moving forward, we're going to touch on that Deuteronomy 32 worldview and take a look at where we see it in Daniel. So we find a passage in Daniel chapter 10 that also presumes the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Now, here, Daniel has a vision about a, quote, man dressed in linen, described as follows in Daniel 10, verse 6. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a multitude. So, if we think back to descriptions of divine beings in the ancient Near East, which we actually covered in lesson 2, the Satan, so go and check that out if your memory's a little bit fuzzy on that. We know that words such as luminescence or shininess are actually indicative of such figures. People thought that the celestial beings, these shiny objects, the starry objects in the sky, were themselves divine beings. So, the figure who is not directly identified in this passage says to Daniel in verses 12 to 14, "Then he said to me, 'Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia, and came to make you understand what is to happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision is for days yet to come." And then the figure continues in verses 20 and 21. "Then he said, 'Do you know why I have come to you? But now I will return to fight against the prince of Persia, and when I go out, behold, the prince of Greece will come. But I will tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. There is none who contends by my side against these except Michael, your prince.'" So, this word princes in Daniel 10 is a reference to divine beings, not human ones. Note that Michael is called a prince in Daniel 10:13 and Daniel 10:21, a concept which is actually based on the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. And just a side note there, if you're interested in looking into this a bit more in Daniel, I highly recommend John Collins' book, A Commentary on the Book of Daniel. So, the understanding that different nations were allotted to different gods was actually a very well known concept in the ancient Near East. And I would encourage you to search further into the ancient Near concept of the divine council because this was very well known to them. So, not only do we see this in Daniel, but Paul was also paying attention. This concept of cosmic geography, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, was absolutely not lost on Paul. In fact, this absolutely provided the backdrop for Paul's ministry. So, as I mentioned at the conclusion of the previous lesson, Paul was well informed about the divine council, about the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, and it was this concept that acted as the backdrop for his own ministry. And we will get to that in further episodes as we move into the New Testament and sort of pull this whole divine council stuff into the New Testament. I know some folks believe that this is only Old Testament theology, but my goodness, it is not. It is all over the New Testament, and it is absolutely just laying in the background of everything. I promise you that. But let's look at an example of how the Deuteronomy 32 worldview actually informed Paul. So both Daniel 10 and Deuteronomy 32 provide the backdrop for Paul's understanding of the spiritual or the unseen realm. Now, this is well documented in Acts chapter 17, verses 26 and 27. So, why don't we actually go ahead and take a look at that? Acts chapter 17, verses 26 and 27. "And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us." That is completely the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, just all wrapped up into one. So here we're getting the understanding that Yahweh fixed the borders, he scattered the nations, he allotted different people under lesser Elohim, but this was only for a time. It was his hope, it was his predestination that they should seek God, that we as the Gentiles, as the pagans, should go and seek God and feel their way towards him. And this was the backdrop to Paul's doctrine, the fullness of the Gentiles. So my goodness, it wraps it up all right in there with a nice little bow. So Paul is directly hearkening back to the post-Babel situation, the division of nations produced as a result of Yahweh's judgment. So Paul alludes to the purpose of Yahweh's rescue plan in Genesis 12, which is otherwise known as the covenant relationship with Abraham, where the disinherited Gentile nations would eventually be drawn back into having a relationship with Yahweh and ultimately being rescued from their spiritual bondage under the hostile gods. Speaking of which, this is where we start to bridge the gap here. So, we will examine this in more detail as we move into further episodes, but the Deuteronomy 32 worldview is directly connected to Genesis 12:3 covenant with Abraham. It provided the rationale for Paul's ministry to the Gentiles. Paul understood that the ultimate plan was to restore all the nations back to the Edenic ideal. Paul understood that by way of the Abrahamic covenant, every nation would eventually have the opportunity to repent and be welcomed into that covenant in Acts 17, verses 30 to 31, where it says, "The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead." So the children of Abraham meant everyone who has the faith of Abraham, not just those born of Abraham's flesh, as we see in Galatians chapter 3, verses 26 to 29, also known as the true Israel. And if you guys want to get a little bit more information on this, I actually recently just did a podcast episode. It's episode 48. So just go to my main page there on YouTube, and the episode is called "What is Meant by All Israel Will Be Saved." And I do a deep dive into Romans chapter 11, verses 25 and 26. So it's all about Paul's doctrine of the fullness of the Gentiles and what exactly is meant by Israel. Because believe it or not, there's actually a lot of misconceptions about what is meant by Israel. And an Israelite is actually not the same as a Jew. So there's a lot of terminology that we need to get down in order to understand this. So please, if you guys have the time, check it out. It's a great episode. Of course, that's me tooting my own horn there. All right. As we start to round this out, we need to look at how words matter. So the language Paul uses is another solid indication that he definitely had the Deuteronomy 32 worldview in mind, specifically when it comes to the words he uses to describe powers of darkness, so the powers in the unseen realm here. For example, the Hebrew word for prince used in Daniel 10 is sar. Now, in Daniel 10:13, Michael is one of the chief princes. Now, the Septuagint calls Michael the chief archonton. Now, in another Greek translation that's considered older than the Septuagint, the Prince of Persia and Michael, who is Israel's prince, are both described with the Greek word archon. So these are the words that Paul uses when he describes quote rulers of this age in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 verses 6 and 8, or rulers in heavenly places in Ephesians 3:10, and the ruler of the authority of the air in Ephesians 2:2. So Paul would use these words interchangeably with one another with other familiar terms such as principalities, powers, dominions, and thrones. All of these terms are familiar in both the New Testament and the Greek literature for geographical domain rulership. So, periodically, you can find these terms used in relation to humans, but more often than not, Paul actually had divine beings in mind. Now, principalities and powers are used in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, where it says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over the present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." Now, powers and dominions are found in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 20 and 21, which says, "That he worked in Christ when he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, and above every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the one to come." This, of course, is echoed in Ephesians 3:10, which we already mentioned, where it was only after Christ had risen that God's plan was made known to these rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. And then in Colossians chapter 2, verse 15, where Paul speaks of the powers being disarmed and put to shame at the cross. So, to wrap that up, let's summarize everything that we have so far, guys. So, once Yahweh disinherited the nations at Babel and placed them under the rule of the lesser Elohim, the Elohim ultimately became prideful, they ruled unjustly, and were not so keen on giving up their allotted territory. So you can imagine how these guys felt when the Son of God suddenly shows up before the appointed time. They didn't know why he was there. They didn't understand that Christ was there to actually defeat death. They thought when Christ died, when he descended into the abyss, he was staying there. So you can imagine their surprise when he actually ascended. Yahweh's plan of Edenic restoration was rivaled at every square inch, but that obviously isn't going to stop him from reclaiming the nations that rightly belong to him. Okay, so that's going to be everything for today, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. As you can tell, I've already alluded to some things we're going to be talking to in the New Testament with the ministry of Christ and the divine counsel, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. It is not just in the Old Testament, it is all over the New Testament, and it makes the ministry of Christ, the ministry of Paul, it makes everything the New Testament writers were saying so exciting, and it makes so much sense when you understand how this was actually the backdrop for that. All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoy this series. If you have any comments, any questions, please feel free to reach out. You can comment on here. Please like, subscribe, share with your friends, or you can reach out to me at faithin20@gmail.com. You can go to my link tree in the bio, and that has everywhere you can find me. All right, thank you guys so much. I'll see you.